praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. It's time for the GunGuyTV podcast.
Hi, this is Joel Persinger. I'm the Gun Guy. Thank you very much for listening to the GunGuyTV podcast and supporting GunGuyTV the way you do. I am extremely grateful. Just so that you know, the podcast is a 1-hour podcast, the first half of which is syndicated on your favorite podcast player and is completely free for you to listen to. The second half hour appears on Patreon only. So if you'd like to listen to the second half hour, make sure that you join us on Patreon. Now, before I get started, I also want to mention to you that there are other ways that you can support GunGuyTV. One of our sponsors, for example, is Second Call Defense. Second Call Defense provides legal backup for you in the event that you use a firearm to defend yourself, whether that's in your home or somewhere else. I use them personally because I've found them to be the best company around, and I wanted to urge you to do the same. If you'd like to use Second Call Defense as your concealed carry coverage or your home defense coverage for your firearm, please check them out using our link. You'll find a link in the description of the podcast where it is posted, and there are actually descriptions. And if you can't find that because you're listening to it on your favorite podcast player rather than YouTube or on Patreon, then you can go to our website at GunGuy.tv and just click on the Second Call Defense link. I'm recording this on Independence Day, and you're going to hear it probably the day after is when it's going to be syndicated on the 5th. I've been thinking a lot about Independence Day and what it really means. Just about every article I've read or every video I've seen about Independence Day deals with the actual Declaration of Independence and the independence of the United States. But I think to a great degree, Americans tend to think of themselves as very independent folks, probably more so than many citizens of other countries around the world. We are, after all, Americans, and we have an independent streak that's pretty wide and pretty deep, and it's a streak that I'm very grateful for. I got to thinking about it when I was talking to a concealed carry student the other day, and we were talking about how people defended themselves and protected themselves when it was really their responsibility to do it, which I believe it still is, but when it was obviously their responsibility to do it because there was no police force. And then I got to thinking about where did police forces come from in the first place? You see, I'm of the opinion that it is each individual's responsibility to protect themselves. It's not the responsibility of the state to provide that protection. For example, this morning when we got up, there was a helicopter hovering around our neighborhood, and we found out that the helicopter was looking for 2 men dressed in black, Hispanic men dressed in black. Apparently the police were chasing them, and they were letting the neighbors know, if you see them, call police. And they were warning us that these guys could be dangerous. I thought, okay, we locked the door, and we went in the house. And I wasn't particularly worried about it. That's probably because my 12-gauge shotgun is leaning up against the wall loaded, and my wife's Ruger PC carbine is leaning up against the wall loaded, and there's a handgun in the bedroom. And so I know that in our household, first of all, our doors were locked. Anybody that wanted to try to crash through was going to very rapidly wish they hadn't. But what about the neighbors who don't have a firearm? What about the neighbors who maybe were terrified, locking up their doors and worried about these 2 guys who were running loose? Again, the police did not send a police officer to every house to sit in the house and make sure each member of my neighborhood was safe. All they did was fly a helicopter over the top and say, by the way, we're looking for these guys. Be careful. Look out for them. Don't go outside, or whatever. They weren't there to defend me. They weren't there to defend other people. They were there to catch these criminals. Well, I get it, and I'm grateful that they were doing that, but it doesn't defend the citizens because it isn't their job to defend the citizens. It's the citizens' job to defend themselves. Hence the reason, among other reasons, why we have a Second Amendment. But let's go back to police officers policing and where we got them in the first place and what their roles were. I started digging into it and searching around on the web, and I've read a lot of articles about it, and they all seem to have a somewhat common theme, but I think there is one article written by a gentleman named Dr. Gary Potter, which I found to be the most informative. The title of the article is The History of Policing in the United States, and this is only part 1. Now, I'm going to put a link to it in the description of the podcast in case you'd like to read it yourself and maybe look for part 2, which I'm not going to include here. But I am going to read part of this article to you because I think he said it and described it in a way that I just simply can't. I would urge you, don't tune out. You need this basic information so we can discuss why police departments are formed. I think it's going to be an eye-opening experience for you. It certainly has been an eye-opening piece of information for me. So as I read the article, please stick with me. We'll get to the conclusions at the end. Here's the article from Dr. Gary Potter. The development of policing in the United States closely followed the development of policing in England. In the early colonies, policing took two forms. It was both informal and communal, which is referred to as the watch or private for-profit policing, which is called the Big Stick. The watch system was composed of community volunteers whose primary duty was to warn of impending danger. Boston created a night watch in 1636, New York in 1658, and Philadelphia in 1700. The night watch was not particularly effective as a crime control device. Watchmen often slept or drank on duty. While the watch was theoretically voluntary, many volunteers were simply attempting to evade military service, were conscript forced into service by their own town, or were performing watch duties as a form of punishment. Philadelphia created the first day watch in 1833, and New York instituted a day watch in 1844 as a supplement to its new municipal police force. Augmenting the watch system was a system of constables, official law enforcement officers usually paid by the fee system for warrants they served. Constables had a variety of non-law enforcement functions to perform as well, including serving as land surveyors and verifying the accuracy of weights and measures. In many cities, constables were given the responsibility of supervising the activities of the night watch. Now, obviously, before I continue reading, these kinds of law enforcement activities were very informal, and frankly, they really didn't accomplish very much. You had the guy who went around and shook the doors at night and fell asleep drunk in a corner, and that was about it. And even the constables were really not full-time people. They were people that were paid on the piecework basis. If they served a warrant, they got paid. If they didn't serve one, they didn't. And that's kind of how it works. And obviously, there's opportunities for corruption there. The more warrants you serve, the more money you make, so you want to serve as many as you can. And you might try to concoct them along the way. Nevertheless, that's kind of the way it was back then. And during that time, obviously, citizens like you and I had to take their own defense in their own hands because there was nobody there to rush to their defense. There were these warning systems, which is all it really was. But going back to the article, he writes, these informal modalities of policing continued well after the American Revolution. It was not until the 1830s that the idea of a centralized municipal police department first emerged in the United States. In 1838, the city of Boston established the first American police force, followed by New York City in 1845, Albany, New York, and Chicago in 1851, New Orleans and Cincinnati in 1853, Philadelphia in 1855, and Newark, New Jersey, and Baltimore in 1857. By the 1880s, all major U.S. cities had municipal police forces in place. These modern police organizations shared similar characteristics. One, they were publicly supported and bureaucratic in form. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in a minute and how that came about. Two, police officers were full-time employees, not community volunteers or case-by-case fee retainers. Three, departments had permanent and fixed rules and procedures, and employment as a police officer was continuous. Four, police departments were accountable to a central government authority. In the southern states, the development of American policing followed a different path. The genesis of the modern police organization in the South is the slave patrol. The first formal slave patrol was created in the Carolina colonies in 1704. Slave patrols had three primary functions. First, to chase down, apprehend, and return to their owners runaway slaves. Second, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. And third, to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary judgment and summary justice outside of the law if they violated any plantation rules. Following the Civil War, these vigilante-style organizations evolved into modern Southern police departments, primarily as a means of controlling freed slaves who were now laborers working in an agricultural caste system and enforcing Jim Crow segregation laws designed to deny freed slaves equal rights and access to the political system. The key question, of course, is what was it about the United States in the 1830s that necessitated the development of local, centralized, bureaucratic police forces? Well, one answer which you commonly run into is that cities were growing. The United States was no longer a collection of small cities and rural hamlets. Urbanization was occurring at an ever-quickening pace, and old informal watch and constable systems were no longer adequate to control disorder. Did you notice that he wrote no longer adequate to control disorder? He did not write no longer adequate to control crime. That is a key distinction, and he actually covers it in just a couple of seconds. So we'll go over that and continue with the article in a moment. I want to thank you again very much for supporting GunGuyTV the way you do. I also want to suggest that you listen to the entire podcast, and the way that you can do that is by joining us on Patreon. It's not a terribly large expense, but it does help us tremendously in keeping GunGuyTV going. Obviously, this is not what I do for a living, and it does cost quite a bit of money to syndicate podcasts, produce them, do videos, and that kind of stuff. YouTube, on the video front, is constantly demonizing videos and refusing to advertise on them, so the money that we get from there is very, very small. And really, we just need the funds to keep on going. GunGuyTV is not self-supporting. Most of the funds come out of my wife and I's checking account. So if you'd like to join us on Patreon, we'd certainly appreciate the help. It will help us continue to bring you great content, and certainly it will also provide you with some content you won't get here, like the rest of the podcast, and also exclusive videos and posts and pictures and behind-the-scenes content that you can't get anywhere else. So please do join GunGuyTV on Patreon.
The opinions expressed by the Gun Guy are always right, unless they're wrong.
Now, returning to the article. Anecdotal accounts suggest increasing crime and vice in urban centers, mob violence, particularly violence directed at immigrants and African Americans by white youths, occurred with some frequency. Public disorder, mostly public drunkenness and sometimes prostitution, was more visible and less easily controlled in growing urban centers than it had been in rural villages. But evidence of an actual crime wave is lacking. So, if the modern American police force was not a direct response to crime, then what was it a response to? More than crime, modern police forces in the United States emerged as a response to disorder. And what constitutes social and public disorder depends largely on who is defining those terms. And in the cities of the 19th century in America, they were defined by the mercantile interests, who, through taxes and political influence, supported the development of bureaucratic policing institutions. These economic interests had a greater interest in social control than in crime control. Private and for-profit policing was too disorganized and too crime-specific in form to fulfill these needs. The emerging commercial elites needed a mechanism to ensure a stable and orderly workforce, a stable and orderly environment for the conduct of business, and the maintenance of what they referred to as the quote-unquote collective good. These mercantile interests also wanted to divest themselves of the cost of protecting their own enterprises and transfer that cost from the private sector to the state. In other words, the business people of the time didn't want to have to pay to protect their own interests, and they wanted to control the citizens. So they transferred the cost of protecting their own interests in the form of private security to the taxpayer in the form of a police department, so that the police department could control the taxpayer at the taxpayer's expense. Now, if that isn't an eye-opener, I'm not sure what is. You know, what I found fascinating about this article is, as I read it, I realized that nothing has changed. In a very real way, the elites in our country, certainly in my state of California, use law enforcement and the creation of laws not for the purpose of stopping crime or dealing with crime waves, but instead for the purpose of controlling the populace. They use it to get the control they need to achieve the goals they want. I'll tell you a prime example of that is in the city of Portland, Oregon right now. When you have these protests with Antifa and so on that beat people in the public square and the police do absolutely nothing, when that amounts to essentially a violent crime wave and the police do absolutely nothing, you have to ask yourself, are the police being used to deal with a crime wave, or are they being used for political purposes and for monetary purposes by the government officials who control them? Well, I think the answer there is fairly obvious. They're being used by the politicians and political officials who control them and the people who have the money who control those politicians. Otherwise, the mayor of Portland would actually have the police go do something and shut that stuff down and arrest those people who are injuring innocents, but they're not. They're just letting it go. Now, I'm not picking on individual police officers here, and I'm not saying that all police departments are corrupt or any of those things. That's not the point. Here's the point. We're celebrating today, while I'm recording this, we're celebrating Independence Day. On a classic note, Independence Day is the celebration of the independence of the United States from the country of England and the forming of our own country. That's essentially what Independence Day is all about, as I understand it. But nevertheless, as I said at the beginning, Americans are fiercely independent people. But we've lost some of that, haven't we? You know, through the entire history of human existence, up until the very recent time of 1833, when New York instituted a day watch, or let's go back a little further, 1636 and 1658, when Pennsylvania and New York actually started a night watch in the big cities. Up until that time, people were responsible for defending themselves. Up until that time, an average person on any given day needed to be aware of their surroundings. They needed to have good situational awareness. They had to be concerned about marauders and criminals and wars and pestilence and disease and all kinds of things. And so they were aware of what was going on around them more, I would say, than American citizens on average are today, because they had not taken the responsibility for their own safety and their own well-being and ceded that, given that, assigned that to a government organization, which by its very reality of existence cannot fulfill that role. The police cannot be where you need them to be when you need them. What is that old saying? When seconds count, the police are only minutes away. How often do you hear of a police officer having rescued somebody at the very moment they were being robbed at the point of a gun or a knife or some other weapon? It doesn't happen. It may have happened. Sure, I'm sure if we search through every possible example, we're going to find one. But the truth is, there aren't very many, because while criminals may be foolish in choosing the particular mode of making a living that they've chosen, they're not so stupid as to try to rob someone right in front of a cop. And those that are that stupid need to find something else to do for a living, because that's not a good choice of employment for them. They're too stupid to do that. But the truth is, most people that are criminals try to commit crimes out of the view of law enforcement. The one just seems to go well with the other. Let's be a little sneaky because we're criminals. That's what they do. So the chance of a cop actually protecting a citizen from a crime is very, very, very small. When you add into that the fact that the politicians are regularly releasing criminals from prison and back into society again, or the fact that we now have politicians who want to have open borders so that we can let every criminal from every South American country in the world come floating into our country and do whatever they wish, you realize that it is not in the state's interest to protect you any more than it was in the state's interest back in the 1800s to protect the citizens of the time. It was in the state's interest to control those citizens and to bring about what, in their terms, they considered to be an orderly society for the purpose of conducting business, not for the purpose of protecting the citizens. That's why the Supreme Court has come out and said police departments owe no particular duty to protect a citizen. They have no responsibility to do that, even though the side of the car oftentimes says things like protect and serve. That's nonsense. They're not there to protect me or you. So what then is the difference between the time before the institution of any kind of night watch or day watch or police department and the time afterwards? Well, I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Now, I've mentioned a couple of different ways that you can help support GunGuyTV. If you want to do one of them without costing yourself 1 red cent, the easiest way to do it is to shop Amazon through our Amazon link. You'll find that link on our website at GunGuy.tv. It's on a big Amazon banner right on the top. If you click it, it'll take you to Amazon through our Amazon link, and then if you just bookmark that link and use it every time you shop Amazon, Amazon will pay us a little marketing fee. The fact is, it doesn't cost you a dime. Everything for you is exactly the same. Your Amazon Prime will work, your free shipping will work, and it will not take 1 penny out of your pocket, but it will help provide some funding to keep GunGuyTV going. So if you haven't already done it, please go to GunGuy.tv, click on that Amazon banner, and bookmark that link. And then shop Amazon through our link. It'll help us keep GunGuyTV alive.
Shooting straight and always right on target. This is the GunGuyTV podcast.
When you think about this stuff, you come away with the realization that your safety, your well-being, and the safety and well-being of those you love is ultimately your responsibility. That while there are many, many, many well-meaning police officers out there who would love to be there to protect you, they're not going to be able to do it even if they want to. And while there are many well-meaning police chiefs and police sheriffs, I'm sure, they don't have enough resources to assign a police officer to every citizen. And even if you have a well-meaning police department, the fact is police departments were not formed to protect you in the first place. We just discovered that. And you know what? They do not exist to do that today. They exist to establish and maintain order, and that term order is defined not by you and I, who are the people being controlled, but by the politicians that run amok and define that order in any way they please. And no matter how many times you vote or how many times you try to contribute a little bit of money, order is going to be defined by politicians who exist for the sole purpose of being reelected and can only be reelected if they accept large donations from organizations and businesses that have a particular bent, a particular motivation behind that donation. And they will exact their favors in whatever way they can. So ultimately, the system has not changed. Back then, it was the business people, the mercantile interests who were controlling the situation. Now it's businesses of all sorts. And that's why you see the mainstream media do what they do. That's why you see Facebook, Twitter, and Google and these large companies manipulate the way they manipulate. It's not about keeping society safe or making a better America. It's not about any of those things. It's about the almighty buck. That's what it's about. Follow the money, as my father used to say, and you'll find out where the success is coming from. One of the main reasons, I'm going to bring Trump up here, one of the main reasons I really, really like President Trump, I don't know about personally, I've never met the guy, but one of the reasons I really do appreciate that guy is he's unbribable. When you're worth, $5-10 billion and you have your own business and it's established and you've got more money than you can ever spend in your life, what special interest group is going to be able to bribe you into doing what they want you to do? Well, there isn't one. He's totally unbribable. He's unbuyable. I don't think we've had a president like that in a very, very long time. In fact, I can't remember one. I think his motivations are to do for the country what he is motivated to do, and in many respects, that aligns with what I'd like to have done. So I'm going to vote for him again in 2020. I voted for him the first time, and I'll vote for him again. And I'm not going to say, well, sometimes I don't agree with him, but I'm going to vote for him anyway. That's a cop-out. Of course, sometimes I don't agree with him. I've never met a human being in my life I agree with all the time. I've been married for a long time. I absolutely, totally, and completely adore my wife. I really do. I absolutely adore that woman. I'm so grateful that we're married. I can't tell you. I don't know why she married me, but I'm grateful she hasn't figured out she shouldn't have done it. But that doesn't mean we always agree, because sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have to agree to disagree. Well, that happens. That's part of being human. And that certainly happens with somebody who's a political leader. But I am going to vote for Trump again. I urge you to do the same. I think he's our best shot at restoring our country to what it needs to be. But in the meantime, I think it's also important on this Independence Day and the days that follow to realize that independence is not just the independence of a country from another country. Our founding fathers wanted freedom. They wanted liberty. That's what they fought for. They fought for independence because they knew it would give them a chance at freedom and liberty. And I say a chance for a reason, because they were fully aware, if you read various different writings from them, they were fully aware that this country could run amok in a very short span of time. They were very full aware that large special interests might dive in there and start carving up the country for themselves and forcing the citizens into doing things they couldn't do or taking the rights away from the citizens. Hence the reason for the Bill of Rights. Hence the reason for the Constitution. Hence the reason for the First Amendment, which oddly enough is first, which allows us to express our views, whether some politician likes it or not. And hence the Second Amendment, which is second, which allows us the ability and protects our ability to defend the other amendments, to fight back, to resist. That's why those are there. That's why we have them. You know, we have the Third Amendment so that the government can't park government troops in our house, take our house away from us. We have the Fourth Amendment so the government can't just go pell-mell through every house they want to and take whatever they want. That's why those are there. We have the Fifth Amendment to protect our right against self-incrimination. We have the Sixth Amendment that tells the government, you know what? This citizen has a right to have an attorney present anytime you want to question them about any criminal matter. And you cannot drag out court proceedings. They need to happen within a swift, rapid pace so that this citizen gets justice as quickly as possible. That's why we have these amendments, because these are the very violations that were brought upon the founding fathers and the citizens of the early colonies by the British government. These are things they didn't want to have happen again. So on Independence Week, since you won't hear this until probably after Independence Day, on Independence Week, I want you to think of yourself the way the founding fathers thought of themselves, as independent, free people. You are an independent, free man or woman. That's what you are, human being, with your own rights given you by nature or God, however you want to look at it. I look at it as God. You can look at it however you want. And those rights should not be trodden upon or destroyed by a government. And to the degree that they are, that's when we need to stand on that First Amendment and stand on that Second Amendment and realize that the founding fathers gave us an opportunity and the capability to resist. Now we just need to have the historical context and the education and the will to do it. Now, if you're listening on Patreon, I want you to stick with me because I'm going to wrap up this part of the podcast here. And for the rest of the podcast, we're going to talk about what does it really look like in today's world, in today's time, to be an independent American. What does that actually entail? And I'm going to give you some ideas and comparisons. We'll do that in the second half of the podcast. If you're listening on the syndicated part of the podcast, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful week, and wherever you go, whatever you do, please be safe.
You've been listening to the GunGuy TV podcast.